Nord Stream pipeline. They said maybe we could try to overthrow the government of Belarus again, which they actually did in 2020. They had done it before in 2005 and 2001, failed all three times. Which if they did that, boy, that might lead right to a nuclear war right there, man. You don't want to succeed in, especially if it turned bloody, a coup in Belarus. My God. But anyway, then they said we could increase weapons to the jihadists in Syria. We could try to overthrow the government of Kazakhstan. We could increase support for the Ukrainian military. And what's interesting about this, so in other words, see how they're saying, do all these things to essentially agitate the Russians, to keep them off balance, to keep them bogged down, to keep them spending money they can't afford to spend, right? But then all throughout it, they have all these disclaimers where they say, don't listen to us. If you do this, it'd be terrible. Like if you overthrow the government of Belarus, the Russians might just invade it immediately and station nuclear weapons there to make the point, right? If we support the jihadists in Syria, they could break out of the Idlib province and sack Damascus, and then we'd have an al-Qaeda government in Damascus, which is, of course, exactly what happened at the end of 24. They said we could increase support for what was then the ongoing civil war that had broken out after the revolution in 2014. And we could increase support for the Ukrainian side of that, or the Kiev side of that war, but then that could provoke the Russians into a full-scale invasion of the country, which would, of course, be terrible for for Ukraine, and terrible for the United States. A massive expense for us, a humiliation for as far as our international standing and prestige, and, of course, untold chaos for the people of Ukraine. And so we better be real careful about pursuing these policies. And then I swear, you look at how Biden ran things, and it was like he got that memo just without any of the disclaimers. And they just went ahead and did all of these things. And in fact, they were messing around. It was actually the last year of Trump that they tried to overthrow Belarus. So that was independent of Biden's wishes. That was already going on. And then they were messing around in Kazakhstan in January of 22, right on the eve of war, right when you might have hoped that the entire pressure in Washington was to try to figure out a way to avoid war, to prevent this from breaking out. What kind of deal might we have to make with Putin to try to prevent him from invading Ukraine, as they're threatening to do, and were building up their forces in preparation for it. And then what do? They support an armed insurrection in Kazakhstan, that's the big one, right on Russia's southern border there, out of all the stands. It's the most important one, which is just madness. And it goes to show that that's essentially what they're up to when it comes to that, is just, if we can't overthrow Putin, we're going to still weaken him, hem him in, surround him, agitate him, and force him to make commitments. And of course, this is why the war's been going on for 4 years. America could tell Kiev, under Biden or under Trump, that, look, you guys are just going to have to compromise here. Obviously, you've lost, all of Luhansk and most of Donetsk and, for at least half of Zaporozhye and Kherson. And so just make a deal, figure it out. And we're not supporting you anymore. Instead, what they say, remember they said over and over again, we want to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia. Russia might win the war, but no, we promise they won't. But if it takes a long time, good. And in fact, I have a collection of quotes in the book where politicians and pundits and all of these people would say, and maybe they still say this, we're getting such a good bang for our buck in Ukraine. Because just think about it. Russian soldiers are dying, but American soldiers are not. So all we got to do is we just give them money and then they go fight. And then sometimes they wouldn't even make any reference to the Ukrainian soldiers at all. Hundreds of thousands of whom have been killed. Hundreds of thousands of whom have been horrifically maimed. A major part of this country completely destroyed. Huge segments of their population fleeing the country as refugees, many of whom to never come home again. Right, the total destabilization of their culture and society in every way. And then, but you can tune into Fox News or hell, the Democrats too, talking about, or maybe worse, that, but we're getting such a good bang for our buck because we're killing Russians. We're sending them home in body bags. We're sending them home in coffins. We're even killing their generals in the field. But none of our guys are dying. Heh, heh, heh. As though the Ukrainians don't matter at all. And that's the way they think of it. This is inflicting costs on the Russians. Joe Biden would say that over and over again. It's almost like the underpants gnomes thing. With the first you steal the underpants, then question mark, and then profit. Not really sure.
I don't know what that is.
On South Park, the poor, I think it's Butters, the underpants gnomes are stealing his underwear, and they're trying to explain how this is supposed to work. And they don't really have it worked out what they're going to do with the underpants, but they're sure they're going to make a lot of money in the end. And that's the same kind of thing here, where they skip the step about, well, is this really weakening Vladimir Putin's regime, or maybe it's strengthening his regime? Is it, increasing American power and influence in the region, or in fact, we're shown as sort of a paper tiger ourselves, and we've done more than you could have imagined to push Russia towards China and toward the rest of Eurasia. Joe Biden is essentially deliberately trying to prevent them from being part of European civilization to emphasize their turn to the East. That seems to me to be a terrible mistake, and I think part of it is part of the longer term Cold War with China too. And you hear them talk about this, Joe. They'll say, essentially, Russia's friends with China. So there's two things we can do there. And this is what I think Trump would prefer to do, would be just make friends with Russia and pull them away from China. Maybe he's already decided it's too late for that, or he doesn't know how. And then the other side was, no, lure Russia into Eastern Europe, bog them down so they're no use to China. Weaken their power, inflict on them this strategic defeat in Ukraine, so that then they won't be as useful to China in our Cold War with them, or worse, and which I think is stupid and didn't work. I think that was the choice that Joe Biden made, and I think it was totally wrong, because it just strengthened the relationship between Russia and China. The Russians have a huge new pipeline that they opened, well, not that new, about 12 years ago, that they opened to China, and they keep adding to it. So they're able to sell all the hydrocarbons they want, and the Chinese will burn every hydrocarbon you got. So, they really don't need Europe. Joe Biden kicked them out and basically solidified their economic break with Europe, totally unnecessarily, but in a way that didn't really hurt Russia.
And the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline was a part of this? This was to disconnect their oil supply, or the natural gas supply, to Europe? Yeah,
in fact, more specifically, right, it was to make this break to solidify the break between Germany and Russia. So the previous German chancellor, Angela Merkel, she had this project she called Eurasian Home. And what she was trying to do was balance American and Russian interests in Europe, and then they were closing down all their nuclear stuff, all the green movement, environmental stuff. They closed down all their nuclear in Germany. And then the idea was, don't worry, we're going to import all this clean burning CH4 from the Russians. And then, but to the Americans, this is the worst thing that could happen, would be an alliance, or this strengthening, any part of any strengthening relationship or budding relationship between the Germans and the Russians. Because with German manufacturing power and Russian raw materials, and both of their at least potential military strength, that if they have an alliance and dominate Eastern Europe, they can keep everybody else out. And so I think that has always been the British and the American fear there. And, there's here in Austin, there's that sort of corporate CIA, Stratfor, run by this guy, George Friedman.
What is it?
Stratfor, it stands for strategic forecasting. They do dirty tricks. Yeah, it's here in Austin.
Oh, no.
They do some dirty tricks, but I think they mostly do pseudo CIA briefings for corporations and stuff, let them know what's going on in the world, that kind of thing. Mostly. Their emails got leaked on WikiLeaks.org years ago, and they're involved. They're close with some of these color-coded revolutionaries. And anyway, I don't know them or anything, but their leader is a guy named George Friedman. And I'll give him credit. I know he opposed Iraq War II in 2003, because I heard him on the radio back then. But, I'm not vouching for the guy as like a good guy or whatever, but just to say he's sort of like a realist school foreign policy analyst type. Mm-hmm. Not too ideological or anything like that. And he gave a speech years ago where he says, and this is the key words, primordial fear. This is the primordial fear of American, imperial policy planners, is that you would have an alliance between the Germans and the Russians. And so anything that we can do to prevent that, we'll do. Now, I don't know exactly who blew up that pipeline, but I'm sure they had at least the support of the United States. Seymour Hersh has it that it was American military guys who did it. which I think, I don't know. And then there's a whole cover story about this yacht, and then there's 6 different versions of who rented this yacht and whether it was used and whether it was robots or whether it was divers or whatever. And it's all meant to confuse. But
This episode is brought to you by Visible. Spring is in the air, which means time for some spring cleaning. We're cleaning out the garage and finally tossing those mystery cords. But while you're cleaning out your junk drawer, take a look at your wireless bill. Don't fall for wireless traps, tacked on fees, confusing bills, and empty promises. Join Visible and cut out the nonsense. With Visible, you get unlimited 5G data and hotspot on Verizon's network for one flat cost, just $25 a month, taxes and fees included. It's everything you need and nothing you don't. Plus, for a limited time, new members can get the Visible plan for just $20 a month for 1 year using code FRESHSTART. Refresh your wireless with Visible. Head to visible.com to get started. Terms apply. Limited time offer. Subject to change. See visible.com for plan features and network management details.
the bottom line is nobody wants to know, right?
Seymour Hersh, what did he say happened?
He said that it was miners based out of Pensacola, Florida, meaning not pickaxe miners or children, but meaning divers that go down and disable sea mines. That was their expertise. Those were the guys that they sent to do it. And that was I think he did that in the London Review of Books or something like that.
Is that disputed?
Yeah, and including by people who blame the Ukrainians and people who blame, I don't know, like Polish groups or whatever. They had all these different investigations that all led different directions. I know Jeremy Scahill had one version of it, and then James Bamford, who I really respect, he's the guy that wrote all the books about the National Security Agency over the years. And he had it that it was the Ukrainians and they used robots to do it. And he's, sussed that out through documents and stuff and decided that must have been what had happened. And, so I don't know. There's 6 different versions of it, and I'm not choosing which is the favorite here, but I think it's clearly was in America's interest. And of course, Joe Biden and Victoria Nuland have both sort of cheekily said, we're not going to let this proceed. And if they do, we will do whatever it takes to stop it. And so evidently they did. And you could see how they would consider that to be, what they would be trying to prevent would be this strengthened relationship between Germany and Russia.
Where's all that natural gas going now? Is it just pouring right into the ocean?
Well, eventually they capped it, but I think it was the biggest release of methane into the atmosphere ever. It was a huge thing. It was a massive. If you were a liberal, progressive, Democrat, environmentalist type, that ought to be like the most offensive thing you ever heard of.
Yeah, it's way worse than cow burps.
Oh, yeah.
Remember they were worried about cow burps?
Yeah, it's centuries worth of cow burps, man. Centuries worth.
Jesus. So the Kazakhstan thing, I'd never heard of. I hadn't heard a peep about that. I had no idea that we were meddling in Kazakhstan.
Yeah, it was one of those where, much like what just happened in Iran in January, where there's a protest over some economic policy. I think in that case they had cut the gas ration or something like that. And it's, it's a country that's divided by ethnicity. Those borders are in all the wrong places and whatever. So you have sort of the ruling caste and the people on the outs and whatever. So you had a big protest movement, and then all of a sudden there's armed gangs of guys killing cops, seizing police stations, trying to seize airports and this kind of thing. And then what happened was the Russians invaded. They sent regular troops across. They were asked by the government there to come and intervene. And they sent troops. They crushed the insurrection. And then it was funny because Antony Blinken said, "Oh, there's a lesson. When the Russians come, they don't ever want to leave." And then the next day they turned around and left. And then they invaded Ukraine. They haven't left there since. But
who were these insurrectionists?
I don't know. I mean, I think presumably they worked for the CIA and probably the Turks or something, I don't know.
Just Mercs.
Yeah, them too.
Yeah. And so this whole thing was just what you were saying earlier, just to try to get Russia to be spread as thin as possible, spend as much money as possible, cause as many problems in as many places as possible.
Yeah. And in fact, the same George Friedman from Stratfor, I think it's in that same speech or maybe a different one where he says, Yeah, when Iran is doing a little bit better, you hit them. When Russia's doing better, you hit them. When China's achieving a thing or two, you hit them. You do whatever you can to always be effing with everybody all the time in order to, that's how to press your advantage, which I think is totally just short-sighted. It's high time preference, sort of government thinking, right? That like, well, if we can get away with this now, we should, without really thinking about the long-term consequence. In fact, that was one of the things that failed to impress at Oxford that I brought up that I thought was crucial, that is in my book, is Strobe Talbott, Bill Clinton's guy, who originally opposed NATO expansion and then later championed it. In 2018, when it was the middle of the war, the civil war, so-called, with America supporting Kiev and the Russians supporting the so-called rebels on the other side, a New York Times reporter named Keith Gesson went and interviewed Strobe Talbott. And it just kind of went without saying that, like, clearly what is going on here is the project of NATO expansion has sort of blown up and caused all these problems. What are we going to do? And what do you think now, pal? I forgot exactly the way you phrased it, but it's sort of, what do you have to say for yourself, Strobe? And so Strobe Talbott says, well, listen, he goes, when you're in power, you have one job, and that is to pursue your nation's national interests. And if you don't do that, well, then you won't be in power very long. So that was what we had to do. But then he says, now, maybe should we have had a higher, wiser conception of our national interest? Maybe. In other words, at the time, what they were thinking is, we want Lockheed dollars and we want Polish votes for 1996, Illinois' crucial swing state. Right. So, or was, I don't know if it still is. So that's why we got to do this, because it's in America's national interest that Bill Clinton get reelected and we all get to keep our jobs. So we're gonna make these promises to these people and pursue this policy for our narrow interests as rulers of the empire. But then, if he had had a higher, wiser conception of America's national interest, he might have thought, wow, are we scheduling a military conflict with Russia for the next century? And maybe we shouldn't do that. Maybe we should look at it like, actually, nothing in the world is more important than America continuing to get along with the Russians. And again, when the communists are long gone, so whatever problem you have with these guys, it ain't Stalinism and it ain't evangelical Marxism at the point of a rifle, right? I mean, this is just whatever it is, we can deal with it. And so, no, they chose the lower, dumber conception of America's national interest instead of the higher, wiser one. And they blew it,
Is there anyone that's ever made the argument to you, like where you've had these debates, where you have a utopian perspective on international relations and that this libertarian ideology of like staying out of people's business, staying out of what you'll do if you don't fuck with the Russians, you don't keep them spending, you don't keep them stretched out, they'll just amass more and more power, and then they'll start to try to take over what was traditionally the Soviet Union, what was originally the Soviet Union.
Yeah, it just so happens, right, that America never leaves anybody alone, so we just don't have a controlled experiment, right? We're constantly provoking, and everything that we see them do is clearly a reaction. And it's just like when we talk about terrorism, again, I'm not in any way justifying it, but I'm just saying, we have so much intervention preceding the terrorism, you have to be able to attribute that.
Yes.
But now, so how would things be otherwise? For example, if H.W. Bush had just said, okay, well, we won the Cold War, Pat Buchanan's right, let's just come home, and had brought the empire home from Europe, then what would happen is the Germans would have reunified, and then they would have joined into a new European Union army with the British and the French and probably the Poles, and then it would have been on them to keep the peace between each other, to police the smaller countries in their region, and hopefully strike a long-term security partnership with the new red, white, and blue Republican Russians. And, if people want to say, and in fact, the other side in that debate at Oxford, Daniel Fried said, yeah, but it was Poland wanted to join our alliance. It's not like we made them, they wanted to. But the thing is, yeah, they might have reason to fear Russia based on old things. But the question is, why are we obligated to be the guarantor of their independence? It's too far from here, and it's something that we're no good at. We only cause problems, and something that the other European states, who are all Western Christian capitalist democracies and friends of ours that they can all work together and solve on their own. I mean, when Germany reunified, it's not like the commies were taken over. It was the West that was dominant in the new Germany, right? These are our pals. There's no reason in the world that America should have had to have, well, for example, like a big part of the horrible war in the Balkans was because of a contest for power between America and Germany over who's going to be dominant in the former Yugoslavia. We should just let the Germans have it. Or, I mean, not have it and kill everybody or whatever, but God, it could hardly have been worse than what America helped to cause there by trying to compete with the Germans for dominance in a land that's quite literally 6,000 miles from here.
But is the fear from the American side that if you let other countries consolidate power, if you let them grow in influence without fucking with them and keeping them spread out like we're doing with Russia, that they'll eventually get stronger and then they'll become a real problem?
I mean,
and
maybe.
they keep them weak, keep them distracted, keep them engaged in this Ukraine conflict and Kazakhstan and anything else you can cook up.
Yeah.
And that keeps them down.
Well, it's like this. When it was the Cold War against the Communist Soviet Union, I was a kid, and I'm not an expert on all of that history. I think there were real questions about the dangers of world communism at that time, where at least I'd be willing to hear you out. But since the end of the Cold War, no, there's just no justification for it, because as Bill Hicks would say, right, like just spin the globe, man. There's no countries out there, right? Every power in Europe is our friend and no threat to us and mean us no harm whatsoever. There are no powers in Egypt, in Africa that count at all, except for Egypt, which is our friend. India will be a power in 100 years from now. China is a rising power, but we've been their